that are available now than that were even available 10 years ago. And if anyone's interested specifically on resources like that, you can email me at UVA, and I'd be glad to send you information or connect you with sites that you can look at to be able to begin to incorporate some of that material in your classes or in your community groups and things of that sort.
And Kevin, I think I'd like to jump in here with point of view anyway, and certainly my point of view, although stated very emphatically, doesn't mean that you have to believe it necessarily. But what I do think is very important is that when you look at these things, my own background was in sociology, so I look at it in a broad sense, and I look at lives of institutions. And one of the things that is happening now, and a very exciting experience for me, is that the Department of History of Virginia Tech and the kind of work that you do, Kevin, is beginning to say that the university takes some responsibility for fast forwarding on many aspects of history that have been left undone. And as Dr. Grimes has certainly pointed out, is that there's a lot of information about the nature of education at the time of desegregation. There is no doubt about it in my mind, Peter, and Peter and I have never talked about this directly, that the majority of African Americans had very, very poor educational opportunities. They were awful. They were like my one-room school. They were like a lot of education for whites in rural America. So there's been that unevenness. But what has been left out of the history entirely are the places like Christiansburg Institute. Christiansburg Institute is one of a genre of institutes that flourished throughout the South, and these were all interestingly built mostly with religious philanthropic organizations. They were both black and white in terms of their teaching staffs, in terms of their founders, in terms of their financiers. So that there is a history of what went on in this country that has completely been ignored, and thank heavens I'm looking over there at the person who played the dean today, that his department and Peter Wallenstein to my right, that are now becoming my colleagues, and Tom, we are building a partnership that will really explore that history and move it not only out of Christiansburg Institute, but throughout the antebellum South, is my understanding, right, Tom? Anyway, you can see how I will expand these things, but I think that the recording of that, as you looked at public history, is probably the most vital instrument we have for bringing into these were all private schools. Christiansburg Institute became a public school in 1934.
If I might add, I truly believe in top-down, but also bottom-up, that it doesn't necessarily take teachers or educators or schools to do this. Families, community people, church people, doing oral histories, having either a personal interest or through family or through students, looking at our own communities. There's so much of this that's there that's just waiting to be tapped. And particularly because of the point in time where we are, many of the people who were involved in these movements are very old and are dying, and for various reasons are ready for the first time to talk and to share perhaps in ways that they haven't been before. And I think it speaks to what was very common in schools in the 30s and 40s in the African American community, and that's the intergenerational nature of learning. And as we move into this 21st century, we're Twittering, we're Facebooking, we're doing all of this. I'm very concerned, just as a communicator, of how we are not personally connecting with one another, and that we're losing the senses of doing that, and it's those areas in which oral histories and the things that I've just mentioned would flourish. So I think it's really important that we look individually and see what are the things that we can do to begin to make those individual connections, and then we have the beauty of having the technology to be able to, to spread that. I mean, look at what YouTube has done, in just such a short period of time. Why can't that be used to tell histories? Why can't that be used for sharing? We have the capacities as individuals to do it, but it's taking those things and using them in different kind of ways to educate and empower and make connections, and not just have this information just evaporate.
And Elaine has alluded to something that I failed to mention earlier, a wonderful collaborative effort. Our institution has had an epiphany I think that the Department of History has had some time ago in the wonderful work that they've provided to the Christiansburg Institute, but a collaborative effort involving other cross-functional partners at the institution, local governments in Christiansburg and Blacksburg, and again, the Department of History have come together to really work collaboratively to think about and implement ways in which we can preserve the wonderful legacy of the Christiansburg Institute and ultimately help to revitalize and cement it in the minds of many. So again, I want to thank Elaine for remarking that, and again, thank really the Department of History who has acted as a trailblazer with regard to this effort, and again, those other additional cross-functional partners at the institution. Are there any additional questions?
Well, there's no doubt there's clearly structural inequality. And in many ways, schools in the United States have borne the brunt of this issue, when in fact, schools have been affected by it, but have not necessarily been the cause of it. It's structural inequality in terms of economics, because let's kind of back up. Schools are in neighborhoods. How do people choose, neighborhoods? They choose it by housing. They'll pick the housing and they'll go to those certain neighborhoods to get certain schools. And so as long as you have a system that has the tax structure such that it is, so tax dollars aren't equitably spread throughout particular communities, you're always going to have this imbalance, because people are going to look to go to the community that has usually the nicer houses for the good schools, which is a result of the taxes. And so in many ways, schools and educators are expected to fix, quote, a problem or an issue that we really have not created, because people are continuing to migrate and move. That being said, we still have the issue of what has become the resegregation in schools. That's why we're seeing so many elements of school choice: charter schools, vouchers, homeschooling. I'm doing research in an area looking at African Americans in homeschooling. And in 2003, there were 1.1 million students who were homeschooled. 100,000 of those children were African American. And we have a portrait of what we think homeschooling looks like. It's an extremely diverse portrait in terms of income, locale, beliefs, and so on. I'm not saying that that is a solution, but I'm just saying that these are kind of the ways where, because of the system is structured the way it is, people are trying to find places and spaces for how they're going to educate their children. So I think it's something we all struggle with. I don't know necessarily that there's one huge umbrella solution, because by very nature of the structure of our schools, they're locally, quote, funded and organized, although we know that federal, state, local management and guidance, has been blurred. But I think it's really important for people to look at their individual communities, to do their homework of what exists there, to try to make the community, parent, school connection. And it really is going to take a collective, collaborative effort. No one particular group of people can do it to make it happen. And we all, it's our children. Marian Wright Edelman says this would all be settled if kids voted. But that's the one thing, the people who really are most impacted by all of this don't really have the voice that they need to have. And that's why it's so important that those of us who do care about these issues are advocates for children who normally can't do that, because people like Barbara Johns and what she did were extremely, laudable and commendable, but we have to look at the reality of how that, would be duplicated.
I would just like to share with you my thinking. I always jump immediately to institutionalization. all of us live in a context. All of us have an environment that we grew up in. We all have rules and regulations. I think that this whole issue of how do we educate our citizenry has to be looked at differently. I don't think that we can move further with the terms that we use, which is and we get to that very touchy thing with many people. I would say the majority, it seems to me sometimes, but maybe not, of how our citizens feel like what should be the responsibility of government as it pertains to the well-being of our citizenry. That, to me, is a very fundamental question. I won't bore you with the answers. I'll just leave that for you to think about. What should be the responsibility of government to meet the needs of its citizens? And the second part of that question, what role does government play in providing decent and appropriate distribution of the resources that are required to meet the children where they are? When are we going to say that the only way that you can get to educate your child is to become filthy rich, pay $20,000 or $40,000 for elementary school educations, so that you can make sure that child has every opportunity to learn? How does that reconcile with a democratic nation? These are fundamental questions that we have had maybe sometimes the good fortune and sometimes the misfortune of having had so many resources and such rapid and really Herculean growth. It's a fantastic country. But there are fundamental questions that we have to go back and revisit, I believe, in order to do what you're saying, because our children are most important. And there is no way that presently school boards and others can redistribute resources in a way that will offset the learning needs and opportunities that face urban areas where you're talking about millions of people whose lives are affected, and an overwhelming majority of those are poor.
Here are two fragments to another take on it, looking not so much where do you go from here as how did we get here. If one of those would be, people vote with their feet, after all. When Prince Edward's schools were closed, it certainly made it necessary, but it would have happened largely anyway, that white parents pulled their kids out of the public schools and put them into private schools. So now what happened when the schools reopened in 1964 is you had an almost totally segregated environment where the public schools were black and the private school was white. Another way in which that works out is when people leave the central cities and move to the suburbs. They're voting with their feet, they're withdrawing from the cities and going off to what for a long time at least has been a much more homogeneously white social environment. The neighborhood creates the schools. That's a good way to get at it, but it's only a partial answer. Here's the other fragment, that the neighborhoods are themselves an artifact of public policy. When I look back at a time between the New Deal and shortly before Brown, I see a world in which the federal government, not playing the role that Elaine pointed toward, but playing a role requiring residential segregation, mandating it as a condition of the kinds of loan guarantee certificates that made suburban development possible. And therefore, you see the distinction between Southern de jure, by law, school segregation, and Northern de facto just sort of happened, is a fallacy in itself, and it lets people think that, in fact, it just sort of happened that way. But the architecture behind it very clearly had consequences, and those consequences flow on. So you've got two different things going on. One is private preference, the other is public policy. And where they come together in a particularly acute way might be this, that you didn't have the option of creating multiracial residential environments where the schools themselves would be not segregated, because that question had already been answered. That option had been foreclosed. Lots of lost opportunities along the way.
We'll just take these last two questions.
Okay, I'm in this department, and I'm going to share a little bit of history with you. The Brown decision, the Supreme Court in the 1970s, we don't really decisions that essentially neutralize ground, and then afterwards they make more decisions that neutralize ground. But these two decisions have helped to create the mess we have today. The first one was Milligan versus Bradley, and the Supreme Court ruled that Detroit's suburbs did not have to be included in any cross-district or city suburban plan for busing. So that left an escape hatch for those whites who did not want their children attending schools with the black kids in the cities to go out to the suburbs where they thought they would be safe. So that made busing in majority black cities like Detroit, Baltimore, and elsewhere rather a moot point. The second and just as damaging decision was Rodriguez versus Texas in the 1970s, when the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution did not guarantee equal expenditures on public schools. The state of Texas was sued because of the vast disparities in educational funding for districts that had were majority Latino or black and a majority white. They wanted to equalize that across the state with a statewide property tax, and the Supreme Court ruled the Constitution did not require that. And so those two rulings have helped to create the mess we've had today. And one more little historical note. Back in the 60s, when I was not a lot younger, I was in college, high school and college, and sometimes I think I was a lot smarter then. I knew, and I kept agitating, that the basis of the civil rights movement should be based not necessarily on desegregating theaters or restaurants or things like that, as important as that was, but the basis should be on desegregating housing and breaking up the housing apartheid that confined black folk to the least desirable parts of urban areas and shut them out from where jobs were and where good schools were, and had housing desegregation proceeded back in the 60s and 70s at the rate it might be proceeding today. Of course, the economic collapse is changing a lot of things. We might have more interracial, biracial, and multi-racial neighborhoods today, and our schools would be truly integrated. Busing, as desirable as it might have been, didn't really deal with that problem. It was kind of putting a Band-Aid over a gaping wound. And one last point, and I'll keep quiet. This current, like I said, our current economic Great Recession or Depression or whatever, is an opportunity for us to rethink our systems. I've come to the sad but inevitable conclusion that our educational system, K through 12, our college education system, all our systems have now become dysfunctional and unsustainable. And I think we're going to have to start rethinking how we organize our society, because I think if we don't know now, we are going to continue to learn the hard way that we can't go on the way we've been going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Woody.
A follow-up fragment. There's a clear contradiction in a way in what I said about people voting with their feet. Clearly, that's not true of people whose feet would take them to a place they're not permitted. And so the segregated residential neighborhoods then forecloses opportunities. There's a youngster late on in the film, Deliberate Speed, musing from Fairfax County, musing about, well, why doesn't just everybody move to Fairfax County?
Yolanda?
Good afternoon, panel. My question, and Dr. Farrar kind of segued to that, given the historical inadequacy that have played the education of African Americans in this country, what do you feel is the role of historically black colleges and institutions now, and is that role still relevant, and how do you think it's going to continue to be relevant and remain viable in the future?
That's a very tough question, because I think that they continue to thrive because there is a sense, it's hard to think of a sense of freedom that was created by segregation. But you do not know, if you have not lived in a world in which you were not the beneficiary of the segregated world, you would not know what a relief it is to not have to worry about race. I'm sure that many people who are not African Americans would like not to be worried about it too. It's a terrible thing. But certainly in the historically black colleges, there is a sense of ease and freedom and openness of interaction that was characteristic of the school that I was in. And many of those values they are very lively there. And students, therefore, do not get, they have conflicts, they're just like, we're like everybody else, but the point was that somewhere the shared culture enabled people to bear the ordinary day-to-day conflicts that come in with bullying or I don't like you. They don't cut as deeply. And I can tell you, as an African American, I am now in my 75th year, and I still cannot remove the level of pain that comes to me when I encounter blatant, vicious racism. I do not have the thought I had about distancing myself from white. I've given up my own learned prejudices about who white people are. But when you are an African American and then you have borne the history of slavery, and when you meet today, I can tell you, on Virginia Tech's campus when I was a student, when I go to the mall and all of these places, I meet racism every day of my life. So it's very hard to disassociate from that incredible weight that my heritage imposes upon me. And so when you're at these schools where you don't have to worry about this, it's, they become what is it, that wonderful song, the wind under your wings, and then you can fly. And I think that until we have to, in fact, help those schools sustain themselves. But at some point, my ideal of the United States would be that it would have as many white students as black students. They would just be outstanding educational centers to take care of the citizens of this particular nation. I don't think I will live to see that, but that's the road I travel. I hope that's helpful, I'm not sure. But it certainly was something I needed to say. I'm sorry.
We live in a world where there are reflecting the past, historically white and historically black schools. And when you run the numbers, they're not radically disparate. Young kids coming out of high school as black college students in Prospect choosing which way to go, the historically black school or the historically white school. And they're clearly going to be very different kinds of social environments than the way that Elaine has just spoken to. When Tech for the